On the morning of February 14, 1942, General Major Georg Thomas set down his pen and reviewed the figures one final time. As chief of the War Economy and Armaments Office, Thomas had spent 6 weeks compiling the most comprehensive analysis of American industrial capacity ever attempted by German intelligence. The document before him, 137 pages of production statistics, shipping estimates, and manufacturing projections, would determine whether the Reich could win a war against an enemy separated by 3,000 miles of ocean. His conclusion was unambiguous. America could not replace losses fast enough to matter. The United States possesses significant industrial potential, Thomas wrote in his summary for the Führer, but potential is not production. Converting civilian factories to military output requires 18 to 24 months under optimal conditions. American shipyards, currently producing at approximately 1.2 million tons annually, cannot meaningfully expand within the time frame of active operations. We calculate that for every American merchant vessel sunk by our U-boats, the enemy will require 9 months to produce a replacement. At projected sinking rates of 600,000 tons monthly, American shipping capacity will reach critical deficit by autumn 1942. The mathematics are irrefutable. Thomas was not a fool. He was a trained economist who had studied American industrial methods and understood their theoretical strengths, but theory, he believed, could not overcome geography. Steel mills in Pittsburgh could not defend convoys in the Atlantic. Aircraft factories in California could not replace bombers lost over Europe in time to affect the outcome. The Americans would build eventually. Of this Thomas had no doubt, but eventually was too late. The war would be decided before their factories reached full production. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, received Thomas's assessment with satisfaction. His submarines were already savaging Allied shipping, sinking 500,000 tons in January alone. If German intelligence was correct, if the Americans truly required 9 months to replace each lost vessel, then the Battle of the Atlantic was already won. The numbers did not lie. The Americans are prolific but slow, Donitz remarked to his staff on February 20th, 1942. They build like elephants, massive but ponderous. By the time their factories achieve full mobilization, there will be nothing left to mobilize for. We will have starved Britain into submission and established a defensive perimeter that no American industrial capacity, however vast, can breach. What Donitz did not know, what Thomas had not calculated because no German analyst believed it was possible, was that even as he spoke, an American industrialist named Henry Kaiser was preparing to build ships faster than Germany could sink them. Not marginally faster, not incrementally faster, 10 times faster. The 9-month replacement window that German intelligence considered irrefutable was about to collapse into 27 days. The mathematics that Thomas had called irrefutable would prove to be not merely wrong, but catastrophically, impossibly, civilization-alteringly wrong. The Germans had measured American industry by European standards. They were about to discover that America did not operate by European standards. America operated by standards that had not yet been invented. German confidence in their industrial assessments was not arrogance, it was experience. The Reich had spent 2 decades studying mobilization, their own and everyone else's. They had watched the First World War consume 4 empires in an attritional struggle that rewarded the nation with the deepest industrial reserves and the longest endurance. They had learned from that catastrophe. German planning for the next war was built on a simple principle: win quickly or do not win at all. This was the logic behind Blitzkrieg. Not merely tactical innovation, but industrial necessity. Germany lacked the raw materials for a prolonged conflict. Her oil came from Romania, vulnerable to interdiction. Her iron ore flowed from Sweden through sea lanes the Royal Navy could close. Her manpower, though substantial, could not match the combined populations of her potential enemies. Every month a war continued was a month Germany's relative position weakened. The Wehrmacht's stunning victories in 1939 and 1940 had validated this doctrine. Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6, the Low Countries in days. These campaigns had not been won by industrial superiority. Germany produced fewer tanks than France in 1940, but by speed, concentration, and the paralyzing shock of modern combined arms warfare. Industrial capacity was irrelevant if the enemy surrendered before his factories could respond. This experience shaped how German intelligence assessed America. Colonel Ulrich Liss, chief of Foreign Armies West and one of the Wehrmacht's most respected intelligence officers, had compiled a comprehensive study of American military potential in early 1941. His conclusions echoed throughout the German high command. American industrial capacity is vast but diffuse. Their factories are optimized for civilian production, automobiles, refrigerators, consumer goods. Converting these facilities to military output requires extensive retooling, worker retraining, and supply chain reorganization. Based on the British experience of 1939 to 1940, we estimate 18 months minimum before American factories achieve significant military production. Based on American performance in the First World War, we estimate 24 months before this production reaches European theaters in meaningful quantities. Liss was drawing on solid historical data. When the United States entered the First World War in April 1917, it had taken nearly 18 months before American forces engaged in significant combat operations. American factories had produced abundant equipment, but most of it arrived after the armistice. American soldiers had fought with French artillery, French tanks, and French aircraft because their own industries could not deliver in time. The Germans expected history to repeat. They calculated that even with American entry into the war, 18 to 24 months would elapse before meaningful American material reached the battlefield. In that window, Germany would consolidate her conquests, fortify her perimeter, and present the Americans with a fait accompli too costly to reverse. This calculation informed every aspect of German strategy. The U-boat campaign was designed not to defeat America outright. Dönitz knew that was impossible, but to delay her intervention until it no longer mattered. If German submarines could sink Allied shipping faster than American yards could replace it, Britain would starve. If Britain starved, there would be no platform from which to launch a reconquest of Europe. The Americans could build all the tanks and aircraft they wished. Without a base from which to deploy them, the equipment would rust in depots from Maine to California. The mathematics seemed precise. American shipyards had produced 1.2 million tons of merchant vessels in 1941. German U-boats had sunk over 4 million tons of Allied shipping in the same period. The deficit was unsustainable. At this rate, Allied shipping capacity would collapse within 18 months, precisely the window German planners calculated America would need to achieve full mobilization. Admiral Dönitz presented these figures to Hitler in a briefing on January 12, 1942. The Führer, for once, asked probing questions about American industrial potential. Dönitz was prepared. The Americans produce automobiles, mein Führer. They do not produce ships. Converting an automobile factory to a shipyard requires specialized equipment, trained workers, and entirely different manufacturing processes. Even if they begin immediately, significant new construction cannot enter service before late 1943. By then, the tonnage war will already be decided. Hitler nodded, satisfied. The numbers aligned with his ideological conviction that America was a mongrel nation, wealthy but decadent, powerful but undisciplined, incapable of the sacrifices that total war demanded. The Reich had forged itself in suffering. The Americans had known only comfort. When the test came, comfort would lose. What neither Hitler nor Dönitz nor Thomas nor Liss understood was that they were measuring American capability by the wrong metric entirely. They were calculating how long it would take America to do things the European way. They had not considered that America might invent a new way. And in a shipyard in Richmond, California, a 60-year-old construction magnate who had never built a ship in his life was about to show them exactly what that meant. Henry John Kaiser had built roads in Cuba, pipelines in the Mojave Desert, and 1/3 of the Hoover Dam. He had never built a ship. He did not know how ships were built. This, as it turned out, was his greatest advantage. Traditional shipbuilding was an artisanal process refined over centuries. Skilled craftsmen, riveters, welders, fitters, shipwrights worked on a single vessel from keel to launch, each step dependent on the completion of the step before. A ship grew organically, piece by piece, in a sequence that could not be rushed because the sequence was sacred. This was how the British built ships. This was how the Germans built ships. This was how American shipyards had always built ships. Kaiser looked at this process and saw waste. They're building ships the way the Egyptians built pyramids, Kaiser told his chief engineer, Clay Bedford, in December 1940. One block at a time, in place, with craftsmen who've spent 20 years learning to do one thing perfectly. That's fine if you have centuries. We have months. We need to build ships the way Henry Ford builds cars. The idea was considered heresy by traditional shipbuilders. Rear Admiral Emery Land, chairman of the U.S. Maritime Commission, openly mocked Kaiser's proposal when it first crossed his desk. "The man builds dams," Land remarked to his staff. "Dams don't float. Ships require precision that construction workers cannot provide. This proposal is the fantasy of an amateur who doesn't understand what he's asking. Kaiser did not understand. He simply refused to accept that understanding was necessary. His proposal to the Maritime Commission, submitted in February 1941, outlined a production method that violated every principle of traditional shipbuilding. Instead of constructing vessels sequentially on a single slipway, Kaiser would prefabricate components at inland factories, deck sections, hull plates, superstructure modules, and transport them to the shipyard for assembly. Instead of skilled shipwrights performing specialized tasks, he would train unskilled workers to perform single repetitive operations with industrial efficiency. Instead of riveting, which required years of apprenticeship to master, he would weld, a technique traditional shipbuilders considered unreliable for hull construction. The Maritime Commission rejected the proposal. Kaiser resubmitted it. They rejected it again. Kaiser flew to Washington and demanded a meeting with Admiral Land. "You're telling me it can't be done," Kaiser said, according to Bedford's later account of the meeting. "I'm telling you, I don't care. I built the Hoover Dam when engineers said the Colorado River couldn't be tamed. I built the Grand Coulee when they said the Columbia was too wide. You say ships can't be built this way because ships have never been built this way. That's not an argument. That's an excuse." Land remained skeptical, but the crisis was undeniable. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than the world's combined shipyards could replace it. Britain was dying by inches. President Roosevelt had called for 18 million tons of new merchant shipping, a figure that traditional methods could not possibly deliver. Something had to change. On April 8, 1941, the Maritime Commission awarded Kaiser a contract to build 30 cargo vessels at a new shipyard in Richmond, California. The ships would be EC-2 type merchant vessels, emergency cargo, designed simplified for mass production. Ugly, slow, and disposable, they were intended as stopgaps until proper ships could be built. The press called them ugly ducklings. Kaiser called them Liberty ships. Construction began on April 14, 1941. Kaiser's shipyard existed only as mudflats and blueprints. He had no slipways, no cranes, no workers trained in shipbuilding. What he had was capital, will, and a production philosophy that would revolutionize industrial warfare. The system Kaiser developed at Richmond was automotive manufacturing applied to naval construction. Components arrived by rail from factories across America, prefabricated sections weighing up to 250 tons, complete with wiring, plumbing, and ventilation already installed. Cranes lifted these sections into place. Workers welded them together. A ship emerged not through the slow accumulation of individual parts, but through the rapid assembly of finished modules. Kaiser hired workers who had never seen the ocean. He trained riveters in 4 weeks instead of 4 years. He employed women, Wendy the welders, the press called them, in roles that traditional shipyards had reserved exclusively for men. He ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with production quotas that his own supervisors initially called impossible. The first Liberty ship from Richmond, SS Patrick Henry, was launched on September 27, 1941, 244 days after the contract was signed, on a shipyard that had not existed when the agreement was reached. Admiral Land sent a telegram of congratulations. It contained a single line: "I was wrong." He had no idea how wrong he had been. The Patrick Henry had taken 244 days. Kaiser was about to build her sisters in less than a month. The first year of Liberty ship production was a disaster that seemed to validate every skeptic's prediction. The welding that Kaiser had championed over traditional riveting proved catastrophically unreliable. In January 1942, the SS Schenectady, a T-2 tanker built using Kaiser's prefabrication methods, broke completely in half while moored at the fitting-out dock in Portland, Oregon. The fracture propagated through her hull in a matter of seconds, a catastrophic structural failure that killed no one, only because the ship was stationary. Photographs of Schenectady's severed bow and stern, jackknifed in the harbor like a broken toy, circulated through the maritime industry as proof that Kaiser's methods were fundamentally unsound. 3 more Liberty ships suffered similar fractures in the following months. The SS John P. Gaines broke in 2 during a North Atlantic storm in November 1943, killing 10 men. The SS Winslow Homer cracked amidships while loading cargo in Boston. German intelligence, monitoring Allied shipping losses with meticulous attention, noted these failures with satisfaction. The American Emergency Shipbuilding Program is producing vessels of inferior quality, wrote Korvettenkapitän Günther Hessler, Donitz's son-in-law and chief operations officer for U-Boat Command, in a February 1943 assessment. Reports indicate structural failures in welded hulls, particularly in cold water conditions. These Liberty ships are being constructed by unskilled workers using methods that prioritize speed over seaworthiness. Many will sink without any assistance from our submarines. The enemy is building coffins, not ships. Hessler was not entirely wrong. The early Liberty ships suffered from defects that traditional shipbuilders had predicted. Welds cracked in cold temperatures. Prefabricated sections did not always align properly, creating stress points in the hull. Workers trained in weeks made mistakes that workers trained in years would have avoided. Quality control, sacrificed to the altar of speed, was inconsistent at best. The British, dependent on American shipping for survival, were particularly critical. First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound sent a blistering memorandum to his American counterparts in March 1942. We are grateful for American efforts to expand merchant shipping capacity. However, we must express grave concern regarding the quality of vessels emerging from the Kaiser yards. 3 ships assigned to North Atlantic convoy duty have been withdrawn due to hull defects discovered during loading. 2 others have reported cracking in heavy seas. We cannot afford to lose cargoes and crews to construction failures. Speed of production is meaningless if the ships produced cannot survive the voyage. American naval architects shared these concerns. Rear Admiral Howard Vickery, who had succeeded Land as Maritime Commission chairman, commissioned an independent review of Liberty ship construction in April 1942. The review's findings were damning. 30% of early Liberty ships showed significant welding defects. Structural failures were occurring at a rate 10 times higher than traditionally constructed vessels. The prefabrication process, while fast, was producing ships that might not survive the conditions they were built to endure. German intelligence compiled these reports with growing confidence. The tonnage war was entering its decisive phase. In March 1942, U-boats sank 834,000 tons of Allied shipping, the highest monthly total of the war. April brought another 674,000 tons. May, 705,000 tons. The Liberty ships were launching, but they were launching into a slaughterhouse. For every ship Kaiser completed, Dönitz's submarines sank 2. General Major Thomas updated his assessment in June 1942. The mathematics still favored Germany. American shipyards have accelerated production beyond initial estimates. However, sinking rates have accelerated correspondingly. Current projections indicate that American construction will not exceed losses until early 1944 at the earliest. Furthermore, reports of structural deficiencies in the new American vessels suggest that actual operational capacity may be significantly lower than raw production numbers indicate. The tonnage war remains favorable. Time remains on our side. Within Kaiser's organization, morale plummeted. The cracking problem threatened to destroy not merely individual ships, but the entire concept of prefabricated construction. Traditional shipbuilders, who had opposed Kaiser from the beginning, demanded that the Maritime Commission return to proven methods. Senator Harry Truman's War Investigating Committee summoned Kaiser to Washington to explain why his revolutionary shipyard was producing ships that broke in half. Kaiser's response was characteristically blunt. "You're asking me why some of our ships have cracked," he told the committee on July 14, 1942. "I'll tell you why. Because we're building more ships in a month than this country used to build in a year. Because we're training workers in weeks who used to train for years. Because we're doing something that has never been done before. And when you do something new, you make mistakes. The question isn't whether we're making mistakes. The question is whether we're fixing them. And we are." He was not bluffing. Even as Kaiser testified, his engineers were implementing solutions. New welding techniques developed at MIT reduced cold temperature cracking by 80%. Improved quality control procedures caught defects before ships left the yard. Design modifications, rounded corners at stress points, thicker plating at critical junctions, addressed the structural weaknesses that had doomed the Schenectady. The fixes arrived faster than the problems. By autumn 1942, the cracking rate had dropped to near zero. The ships that had been derided as coffins were becoming the most reliable cargo vessels in the Allied fleet. But German intelligence did not update its assessments. Thomas's June report remained the operative analysis through the winter of 1942 to 1943. The Reich continued to calculate American production using data that was already obsolete. They did not know that Kaiser had solved the quality problem. They did not know that he was about to solve the quantity problem in a way that would shatter every assumption German planners had ever made about industrial warfare. November 8, 1942, Richmond Shipyard No. 2, 12:01 a.m. The keel of Hull 440 touched the building ways at the stroke of midnight. 12,000 workers stood ready across 3 shifts, their tasks choreographed with a precision that would have impressed a Prussian general. Overhead, cranes swung prefabricated sections into position, 250-ton modules that had arrived by rail from 37 different factories across America. Welders ignited their torches. The clock started. Henry Kaiser had made a bet, not with money, with reputation. He had announced to the press that his shipyard would construct a complete Liberty ship, from keel laying to launch, in under 10 days. The current record was 24 days, itself considered miraculous by traditional standards. Kaiser was promising to cut that time by more than half. The Maritime Commission thought he was grandstanding. The Navy thought he was insane. The traditional shipbuilders who had opposed him from the beginning thought he was about to humiliate himself on a national stage. Kaiser did not care what they thought. He cared about what German intelligence thought, and he wanted them to think the impossible had become routine. Hull 440 rose from the ways like a time-lapse photograph given physical form. The double-bottom sections were in place by dawn. The side shells were welded by noon. The main deck went on as the sun set, workers swarming over the emerging vessel in an ant-like frenzy of coordinated activity. Floodlights illuminated the shipyard through the night, turning the construction site into a stage visible for miles. Clay Bedford, Kaiser's chief engineer, had planned every moment. Each crane movement was scheduled to the minute. Each welding team knew exactly when their section would arrive and exactly how long they had to secure it. Meals were delivered to workers at their stations. No one left the ship for breaks. Medical teams stood by to treat injuries without interrupting production. It was not construction. It was performance art executed in steel. By November 10th, Hull 440 had a superstructure. By November 11th, she had engines. By November 12th, at 3:27 in the afternoon, the champagne bottle shattered against her bow, and the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, from bare keel to floating ship. The workers erupted in cheers that could be heard across the bay in Oakland. Newsreel cameras captured the launch from every angle. Kaiser stood on the platform beside Eleanor Roosevelt, who had agreed to christen the vessel, and addressed the nation via radio hookup. The Nazis believe they can sink ships faster than we can build them. Today we have given them our answer. The Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days. Tomorrow we will build another ship, and the day after that, another. We will bury Adolf Hitler under an avalanche of ships. We will drown his U-boats in steel. Every worker in this shipyard is a soldier, and every ship we launch is a weapon pointed at the heart of tyranny. It was propaganda, of course. The Robert E. Peary had been a stunt. Components pre-positioned, workers rehearsed, every variable optimized for speed rather than sustainable production. Kaiser could not build every ship in 4 days. But that was not the point. The point was that he had built one ship in 4 days. The point was that 4 days was possible. German intelligence received reports of the Robert E. Peary within 72 hours. Korvettenkapitän Hessler read the account with visible irritation and dismissed it as American boasting. A publicity stunt, he wrote in his operational diary. The Americans are fond of such demonstrations. One ship built quickly proves nothing about sustained production rates. Our calculations remain valid. The mathematics of the tonnage war have not changed, but the mathematics had changed. They were changing every day in every shipyard from Richmond to Baltimore, and Hessler was not paying attention. Because the Robert E. Peary was not the story. The story was what Kaiser's methods had done to average production times across the entire American shipbuilding industry. In January 1942, the average Liberty ship required 230 days from keel to delivery. By June 1942, the average had fallen to 105 days. By December 1942, 1 month after the Robert E. Peary's launch, the average was 56 days. By the spring of 1943, it was 42 days. Kaiser's Richmond yards were even faster. Their average construction time by mid-1943 was 27 days. Not a stunt, not a one-time demonstration. The routine, sustainable, day-after-day production of a 14,000-ton ocean-going cargo vessel in less than 4 weeks. The 9-month replacement window that General Major Thomas had calculated as Germany's margin of victory had been compressed into 27 days. Every ship Donitz sank could be replaced. Not eventually, not after the war was decided, but before the convoy schedules were even adjusted. The numbers began to tell a story that German intelligence refused to believe. In 1942, American shipyards delivered 746 Liberty ships. In 1943, they delivered 1,896. The tonnage curve that Thomas had calculated would take until 1944 to exceed losses had crossed that threshold in September 1942, 18 months ahead of his projection. By December 1943, American yards were producing merchant shipping faster than all the world's other shipyards combined, faster than Germany, Britain, Japan, and the neutral nations put together. Admiral Dönitz received monthly updates on Allied shipping production from the German Naval Intelligence Section. Each month, the numbers exceeded the previous month's projections. Each month, his staff assured him the figures must be exaggerated. Each month, the truth grew harder to deny. On March 30th, 1943, Dönitz met with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair to discuss the U-boat campaign. He brought charts showing the tonnage war's progression, charts that should have demonstrated Germany's impending victory. Instead, they showed a production curve rising so steeply it seemed to violate the laws of industrial physics. The Americans, Dönitz admitted, are building ships faster than we believed possible. Our sinking rates remain high, but their replacement rates have exceeded all estimates. We are no longer winning the tonnage war. We are, at best, fighting it to a draw. Hitler studied the charts in silence. The room was very quiet. Everyone present understood what they were seeing. The mathematical foundation of Germany's Atlantic strategy collapsing into irrelevance. How? Hitler finally asked. How are they doing this? Dönitz had no answer. 3,000 miles away, in a shipyard that had been mudflats 2 years earlier, another Liberty ship slid down the ways. And another, and another. One every 42 hours, around the clock, without end. The avalanche began in the spring of 1943 and never stopped. It was not merely ships, it was everything. The same industrial philosophy that Kaiser had applied to Liberty ships was spreading through American war production like a doctrine of multiplication. Aircraft that German intelligence calculated would require 18 months to replace were rolling off assembly lines in Willow Run, Michigan at the rate of one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Tanks that Wehrmacht planners assumed would take 6 months to manufacture were emerging from the Chrysler Arsenal in Detroit every 30 minutes. Trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, ammunition, every category of military equipment was being produced at rates that German analysts initially dismissed as typographical errors in intelligence reports. The numbers ceased to make sense. They exceeded not just German projections, but German comprehension. In May 1943, General Major Thomas submitted a revised industrial assessment that read like a confession of bewilderment. Previous estimates of American production capacity must be discarded. The enemy has achieved manufacturing rates that contradict established principles of industrial organization. A single American shipyard, Kaiser's Richmond facility, is now producing more tonnage per month than all German shipyards combined. This is not an exaggeration. This is not propaganda. I have verified the figures through 3 independent sources. The Americans are not merely outproducing us. They are outproducing what we believed production could be. Thomas requested permission to visit neutral Sweden to interview businessmen who had toured American factories before the war. His request was denied. The information, his superiors decided, would only damage morale. But morale was already collapsing, at least among those who understood the numbers. Admiral Dönitz watched his tonnage war disintegrate month by month. In March 1943, his U-boats sank 627,000 tons of Allied shipping, an impressive figure by any historical standard. In the same month, American shipyards alone launched 1.1 million tons of new construction. The Allies were gaining 500,000 tons of shipping capacity in a month that should have represented a German victory. May 1943 became known in U-boat command as Black May. Allied anti-submarine warfare had improved dramatically. New radar, new aircraft, new tactics, but the deeper problem was mathematical. Dönitz was losing submarines faster than Germany could build them, while the Allies were building ships faster than he could sink them. The curves had crossed. The tonnage war was over. 43 U-boats were destroyed in May 1943. Dönitz withdrew his remaining submarines from the North Atlantic on May 24th, conceding defeat in the campaign that was supposed to starve Britain into submission. The 9-month window that German intelligence had calculated as their margin of victory had been shattered, not by Allied military prowess, but by American industrial velocity. The enemy has won the tonnage war, Dönitz wrote in his war diary on May 24th, 1943. We can no longer sink ships faster than they are replaced. We can no longer replace our own losses fast enough to maintain operational strength. The mathematics that once favored us now condemn us. Every month the disparity grows. Every month our position weakens. I do not see how this trajectory can be reversed. It could not be reversed. It could only accelerate. By the end of 1943, American shipyards had delivered 19 million tons of new merchant shipping, more than the entire pre-war merchant fleet of Great Britain. By mid-1944, the United States was producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Not slightly more, overwhelmingly more. The ratios were not 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. They were 8-to-1 for aircraft, 6-to-1 for naval vessels, 4-to-1 for tanks. German soldiers began to notice the disparity in ways that statistics could not capture. Obergefreiter Hans Wolf, an infantry soldier on the Western Front, wrote to his wife in August 1944 with observations that would later be collected by American intelligence. You cannot imagine what we face. Yesterday, American artillery destroyed our supply column. 17 trucks, gone in minutes. This morning, I watched through binoculars as another convoy approached our lines. I counted the vehicles. I stopped at 300. 300 trucks in a single convoy, driving in daylight, as if our Luftwaffe did not exist. They do not hide their supplies. They do not ration their ammunition. They fire 1,000 shells to destroy one position and then fire 1,000 more at the next position. Where does it come from? How can any nation produce so much? Our sergeants tell us to conserve, conserve, always conserve. The Americans throw away more in 1 hour than we receive in a week. The psychological impact rippled through the Wehrmacht. Lieutenant Friedrich Gruppe, a tank commander in Normandy, recorded his impressions in a diary entry dated July 18, 1944. We destroyed 4 Sherman tanks today, a good day by our standards. But as I watched them burn, I saw 6 more Shermans crest the ridge behind them, and behind those, more, and behind those, still more. We have nothing to replace our losses. Every Panther that burns is a Panther that will never be replaced. Every trained crew we lose is a crew that cannot be rebuilt. But the Americans, they simply produce more. We kill them, and they multiply. We destroy their tanks, and more tanks appear. It is like fighting the sea. You can push back the waves, but they never stop coming. The waves never stopped. In the 12 months following D-Day, American industry delivered 96,000 aircraft to the armed forces. Germany produced 36,000 in the same period, and lost most of them to Allied bombing of factories that were supposed to be producing more. American factories operated beyond the reach of German bombers, in cities whose names had never appeared on Luftwaffe target lists: Wichita, Seattle, San Diego, Fort Worth. The industrial heartland of the United States was as invulnerable as the surface of the moon, and approximately as accessible to German interdiction. Reichsminister Albert Speer, who had performed miracles of production organization to keep the German war machine running, finally admitted defeat in a memorandum to Hitler dated January 1945. We have reached the limits of what organization can achieve. German industry is now producing at maximum theoretical efficiency, and it is not enough. The American industrial advantage is not a matter of efficiency or organization. It is a matter of scale that we cannot match and methods we did not anticipate. They have not merely expanded their existing capacity, they have invented new forms of production that render our calculations meaningless. We are fighting a war of material against an enemy who has made material itself into a weapon. This weapon cannot be countered. It can only be endured until it destroys us. Speer's memorandum was suppressed. The information, Hitler decided, was defeatist. But the truth could not be suppressed on the battlefield. It arrived every day in the form of shells, bombs, tanks, trucks, aircraft, and ships, an endless river of American production that no German courage or tactical brilliance could stem. The Reich had calculated that American industry would be slow, ponderous, constrained by the same limitations that constrained European manufacturing. They had not calculated for Henry Kaiser. They had not calculated for a nation that could build a ship in 4 days, a bomber in an hour, a tank in 30 minutes. They had not calculated for the simple, terrifying possibility that America could produce war material faster than Germany could destroy it. Now they were drowning in that miscalculation, and the tide was still rising. The final accounting required numbers so large they lost meaning, and testimonies so candid they approached confession. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced 5,777 ocean-going vessels, totaling over 56 million deadweight tons. Of these, 2,710 were Liberty ships, the ugly, disposable freighters that German intelligence had dismissed as coffins. The Liberty ships alone carried 75% of all cargo shipped to European theaters. They delivered 200 million tons of war material to Britain. They sustained the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. They made D-Day possible. Kaiser shipyards, the mudflats that had not existed in 1941, produced 1,490 vessels by war's end. One man's organization, one man's methods, one man's refusal to accept the limitations that traditional shipbuilders considered sacred had generated more tonnage than the entire German merchant marine possessed at the war's peak. The aircraft numbers were equally incomprehensible. American factories produced 324,750 military aircraft between 1941 and 1945. Germany produced 119,307. Japan produced 79,123. The United States alone outproduced both Axis powers combined by a factor of nearly 2, and American factories operated without the constant interruption of strategic bombing that crippled German and Japanese production in the war's final years. Tanks: 88,410 American versus 46,857 German. Trucks: 2.4 million American versus 345,914 German, a ratio of nearly 7 to 1. Artillery pieces: 257,390 American versus 159,144 German. Every category told the same story. The Wehrmacht had entered the war believing that quality could defeat quantity, that superior training and tactics would compensate for material disadvantage. By 1945, they understood that quantity, at sufficient scale, became a quality of its own. The post-war interrogations transformed these statistics into human understanding. General Major Georg Thomas, the economist whose February 1942 assessment had calculated a 9-month replacement window for American shipping, survived the war and was interrogated at length by U.S. Army intelligence in August 1945. His testimony, spanning 3 days, constituted a systematic autopsy of German industrial miscalculation. "We made 3 fundamental errors," Thomas stated on the second day of questioning. First, we assumed American production would follow European patterns, gradual expansion, constrained by the same bottlenecks that constrained our own industry. We did not anticipate that they would redesign production itself. Second, we calculated replacement rates based on traditional shipbuilding methods. We did not know that traditional methods would be abandoned. Third, and this was the most damaging, we believed our own intelligence. We received reports of American production that exceeded our projections, and we dismissed them as exaggeration. We could not accept that our calculations were wrong by a factor of 10, so we rejected the evidence and maintained the calculations. By the time we accepted reality, reality had already defeated us. The interrogator pressed Thomas on the specific moment he understood the magnitude of the error. Thomas was silent for nearly a minute before responding. June 1943. I received a report that American shipyards had launched more tonnage in the month of May than all German yards had launched in the previous year. I asked my staff to verify the figure. They verified it. I asked them to verify it again. They did. The number was correct. 1 month of American production exceeded 1 year of German production. I went home that evening and told my wife that the war was lost. She asked me not to speak of such things. I never spoke of it again, until now. Admiral Karl Dönitz, captured at Flensburg in May 1945, provided testimony that echoed Thomas's conclusions with the particular bitterness of a commander who had watched his strategy dissolve. "The tonnage war was our best hope of victory, not our only hope, but our best. We calculated that if we could sink Allied shipping faster than the enemy could replace it, Britain would starve and there would be no platform for an invasion of Europe. The mathematics were clear. We were sinking 600,000 tons per month. We believed replacement would require 9 months per vessel. At those rates, we would have won in 18 months. The interrogator asked what went wrong. Everything we believed about replacement rates was false, not partially false, entirely false. The Americans did not replace ships in 9 months. They replaced them in 1 month, sometimes less. We sank a ship, and another ship appeared before the convoy schedule could be adjusted. We sank that ship, and another appeared. It was not a matter of fighting harder or sinking more. No sinking rate we could achieve would have exceeded their production. They had made the tonnage war mathematically unwinnable before we understood the mathematics had changed. Dönitz paused, then added a comment that the interrogator noted as particularly significant. I have been a naval officer for 35 years. I believed I understood industrial warfare. I understood nothing. The Americans did not fight an industrial war. They fought a war of industrial magic. They made ships appear from nothing. They made aircraft materialize from empty factories. They buried us in material that should not have existed. I have no explanation for what they achieved. I only know that we could not match it, and because we could not match it, we lost. Perhaps the most revealing testimony came from Reichsminister Albert Speer, the organizational genius who had maximized German production through rationalization, forced labor, and ruthless efficiency. Speer was interrogated extensively at Dustbin, the Allied facility for captured officials, and his comments on American industry carried the weight of a man who understood production better than almost anyone in the Reich. I tripled German tank production between 1942 and 1944. I doubled aircraft production. I achieved efficiencies that my predecessors believed impossible, and none of it mattered. The Americans were not simply producing more than we were. They were producing more than we could imagine. I would implement a new efficiency measure and increase output by 10%. In the time it took me to achieve that increase, American production would grow by 50%. I was climbing a ladder while they were building an elevator. The gap never closed. It only widened. Speer was asked whether Germany could have matched American production given sufficient resources. No, resources were only part of the problem. The larger problem was conception. We thought of production as a fixed process to be optimized. The Americans thought of production as a variable process to be reinvented. They did not optimize shipbuilding. They eliminated shipbuilding as it had existed and replaced it with something new. We could not match that because we could not conceive of it. You cannot compete with a revolution you do not recognize as revolutionary. The interrogation transcripts were compiled into a classified study titled German Assessments of American Industrial Capacity, 1939 to 1945, distributed to the Army War College in 1947. The study's conclusion distilled the lesson into a single paragraph. German intelligence failed to anticipate American production rates not through lack of information, but through failure of imagination. Every relevant data point was available to German analysts before the war: American industrial output, workforce capacity, raw material reserves. What was not available, because it did not yet exist, was the methodological revolution that transformed American potential into American production. The Germans measured America by European standards and concluded that European constraints would apply. They did not consider that America might create new standards. This failure of imagination cost Germany the war as surely as any failure on the battlefield. The men who had calculated the mathematics of American industrial limitations spent their post-war years confronting a truth that no formula had predicted. The mathematics had been correct. The assumptions had been catastrophically, completely, and irreversibly wrong. General Major Georg Thomas died in 1946. 1 year after the war, he had helped lose through calculations that proved worthless. In his final months, confined to an Allied detention facility awaiting denazification proceedings, Thomas requested permission to write a memoir. The request was granted. He completed 127 pages before his health failed, almost exactly the length of the industrial assessment he had submitted to Hitler in February 1942. The memoir was never published. It sat in U.S. Army archives until 1978, when researchers discovered it while compiling documents for a study of German wartime intelligence. The final chapter was titled, What We Did Not See. I have spent the months since Germany's surrender attempting to understand how I was wrong, Thomas wrote. I was not wrong about American industrial capacity. The steel mills, the factories, the workforce, these I measured correctly. I was wrong about what Americans would do with that capacity. I assumed they would use it as Europeans use industrial capacity, methodically, incrementally, within established frameworks. I did not imagine they would shatter the frameworks entirely. When I calculated that American shipyards would require 9 months to replace a lost vessel, I was calculating how long it would take to build a ship the way ships had always been built. I did not consider that someone might build ships a different way. When I projected American aircraft production would reach meaningful levels by 1944, I was projecting based on how aircraft factories had always operated. I did not consider that someone might make aircraft factories operate differently. This was not an intelligence failure. It was a failure of imagination. We could not conceive of what the Americans conceived, and so we could not predict what the Americans achieved. We measured their potential by our limitations. We should have measured their potential by their own. Thomas died before completing his analysis. The final pages of his manuscript trail off into fragmentary notes, statistics, dates, ship names, a list of questions he never had time to answer. The last complete sentence reads, "They did not defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with production. The weapons were merely how the production killed us." Henry Kaiser outlived the war by 22 years. He never built another ship after 1945. There was no need. The emergency that had called his shipyards into existence had passed. He turned instead to automobiles, aluminum, cement, healthcare. He built hospitals, highways, and the planned community of Hawaii Kai. When he died in 1967, his obituaries mentioned the Liberty ships as an accomplishment among many, not understanding that those ugly, disposable freighters had altered the trajectory of human history. The shipyard at Richmond is a park now. The cranes are gone. The slipways have been filled and landscaped. A single Liberty ship, the SS Red Oak Victory, sits at permanent anchor as a museum, her hull restored, her cargo holds empty, her engines silent. Visitors walk her decks and read plaques explaining how ships were built in 27 days during a war that required them faster than anyone believed possible. Few visitors understand what they are looking at. They are looking at the weapon that broke the Third Reich, not through explosive force, but through mathematical inevitability. Every Liberty ship that slid down those ways was a defeat Germany could not prevent. Every cargo that reached Britain was a bullet the Wehrmacht could not stop. Every replacement that appeared before the U-boats could reload was proof that the tonnage war had been lost before Dönitz understood it had been fought. Admiral Dönitz spent his final years in a modest house in Almühle, outside Hamburg, receiving occasional visitors who wanted to understand how Germany had lost the war at sea. To those who asked about the U-boat campaign, he gave the same answer for 3 decades. "We sank ships. We sank thousands of ships. We sank more ships than any submarine force in history. And it did not matter. The Americans built ships faster than we could sink them. Not slightly faster. Impossibly faster. We would torpedo a convoy, and by the time we returned to port for resupply, the convoy had been replaced. Every success we achieved was erased before we could achieve the next one. We were emptying the ocean with a bucket while they filled it with a river." Dönitz died in 1980. His war diary, captured at Flensburg and held by Allied intelligence for decades, was returned to Germany in 1975. Historians who studied it found, among the operational orders and situation reports, a single sheet of paper dated March 31, 1943, the day after his meeting with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, the day after he had shown the Führer production charts that should have guaranteed victory and instead foretold defeat. The sheet contained no orders, no analysis, only a question, written in Dönitz's own hand, underlined twice. How do you fight an enemy who can replace everything you destroy? He had spent 2 years trying to answer that question. The answer was, you don't. You don't fight an enemy who can build a ship in 4 days, and a bomber in an hour, and a tank in 30 minutes. You don't fight an enemy whose factories are oceans away from your bombs. You don't fight an enemy who treats production as a weapon, and logistics as strategy, and industrial capacity as the foundation of military power. You don't fight that enemy because you cannot beat that enemy. You can only delay the inevitable, and the inevitable, once American industry achieved full mobilization, was annihilation. General Major Thomas had calculated a 9-month window. He had believed, with the full confidence of German technical education and European industrial experience, that physics and logistics and the inherent constraints of manufacturing would give the Reich time to win. He had been wrong by a factor of 10, not 10%, 10 times, a miscalculation so vast it transformed strategic confidence into strategic catastrophe. The Germans had measured American industry and found it impressive but slow. They had not measured Henry Kaiser. They had not measured the workers who built ships in 27 days, aircraft in an hour, tanks in 30 minutes. They had not measured a nation that looked at the limitations everyone else accepted and decided simply to reject them. The Reich calculated that American factories would need 18 months to achieve full mobilization. The Americans mobilized in 12. The Reich calculated that replacement rates would favor the U-boats. The Americans replaced faster than the U-boats could reload. The Reich calculated that time was on their side. The Americans buried them in time they didn't have. General Major Thomas had written that the mathematics were irrefutable. He was right about the mathematics. He was catastrophically wrong about what the Americans would do to the variables. They didn't solve the equation Germany had written. They wrote a new equation, and the answer was victory.